Here is Dr. Maria Fedoryka. I do know that she is the chair of the philosophy department at Ave Maria University, and she'll be speaking to us this afternoon on von Hildebrand, love, and contraception. Please welcome Dr. Fedoryka.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here with you this afternoon, and I'm very grateful to the organizers and Teresa Notari especially for all the work that she has put into it, and I know many others as well. And I'm very grateful that a slot was given to cover the thought of Dietrich von Hildebrand. I'm very happy that I'm here to be able to hopefully promote sort of a deeper understanding and appreciation of the philosophical merits of his position on marriage, love, and procreation, and on contraception. But I also think that it's a very pastorally compelling position that he has to offer. And I think also you'll see that there are themes in the theology of the body that are adumbrated in von Hildebrand's thought. So without further ado, I'll begin with just something it's very limited. I hope that you go to his work after hearing this talk, because his presentation is actually much, much richer than what I'm able to represent here. So beginning with the earliest of his 4 major works on marriage in 1922, ending with his book-length treatment of Humanae Vitae the same year that the encyclical was issued, Dietrich von Hildebrand was always a strong defender of the Church's teaching on contraception. His writings show his keen awareness of the sanctity and mystery of God's having called creatures to participate in his own creative love, and of the impermissibility of directly altering God's plan in this call. For von Hildebrand, contraception involves an act of irreverence against God and is without exception morally forbidden. He also held that procreation is the primary end of marriage. So thus far, Hildebrand stood squarely with the theological and philosophical Catholic tradition on the matter. But Hildebrand's reflection on the nature of marriage and of sexuality provide, I believe, another powerful defense of the Church's teaching, and one that is different from the tradition, not incompatible with it, but slightly different. It's an argument that he actually didn't himself make, but he laid out all the elements without drawing the conclusion, and that's what I'd like to do today. So I think his unique contribution is found in his idea that the meaning of marriage and the meaning of the spousal act as the consummation of marriage is love, and more particularly, the unique love that is spousal love. In scholastic terminology, Hildebrand holds that spousal love is the defining essence of marriage and of sexuality, the forma. But since love consists of both union and fruitfulness, marriage and the spousal act also contain union and fruitfulness, a union and fruitfulness which is unique to them. So this position, that love is the inner form of marriage and of the spousal act, both unites the two meanings of the spousal act on a metaphysical level. That is, the love between the spouses is not simply something that the spouses bring to the act by their subjective disposition of love. And it truly makes the coming into existence of the child, again, metaphysically speaking, a fruit of love. So for the 1 or 2 persons here who don't know what the term metaphysical or ontological means, it's just sort of a philosophical shop for having to do with the being of a thing. And it usually refers to the deep structures of being. And specifically here, it's meant to be contrasted with something that is the disposition or the attitude of a person. Okay. So I'd like to explore the way that Hildebrand's position can add something new to the traditional defense of the Church's teaching on the essential potential procreativity of marriage and of sexuality. And in particular, I believe that it can actually provide an element of a deeper metaphysical foundation to that position. So I begin with a reflection on the nature of love. According to Hildebrand, love consists of 2 dimensions. Its first dimension is union. This union has as its substance or content a mutual belonging that comes about through the mutual self-giving of 2 persons and the corresponding mutual reception. Spousal love realizes this mutual self-giving in a uniquely deep and total fashion. All love includes the center of the person, but none as deeply and as literally as spousal love. There's a genuine moral entrance into and welcoming of each person's very self into the very self of the other. In the most significant and primary sense of the term, the two become one through this self-giving. The mutual entrance of each into the other means that spousal love is essentially intimate. Again, all love is intimate to some degree, but none as intimate as spousal love. These features of spousal love account for why God could use it as an image of the relationship that God seeks to have with the soul, both in the Old and the New Testaments. He seeks to give his very self to his creature, and he seeks that his creature should receive him and make a total gift of himself in return. But love has another dimension, the dimension of fruitfulness. But when it's said that love is fruitful, this does not in the first instance mean that love exists as a union of two persons and then goes beyond itself and reaches out towards others. On this picture, fruitfulness would not be a part of the internal makeup of love itself, but would merely be a result of the love, in such a way that love would be complete prior to, and in some sense apart from, the fruitfulness. This is not the primary meaning of the idea that love is fruitful. Love's fruitfulness refers in the first place to an element that is part and parcel of the love itself. That is, fruitfulness goes into making up the very essence of love. And I think this is why the term dimension is a very apt one. Union and fruit together make up the two dimensions of the one reality of love. So to reflect on this a bit, on the one hand, when two persons are united in a mutual self-giving, new realities or factors come into existence that cannot be accounted for simply by what each brings to the union. These new factors can be generally captured in the following way. They amount to a new way of being for the two persons, a kind of new life that accrues to them consequent upon their mutual self-giving. So as each dies to himself, they rise to new life, a new life together. On the other hand, while these new factors are not identical to the union, they are so simultaneous with it, so organically related to it, and so inseparable from it, that they in a sense flow back into it, coloring it and leavening it. Because of how closely union and fruit are related, and because only together do they make up the reality of love, we might even at first miss the fact that the union and the fruit are distinct elements of love. But in fact, they are. Okay? So they're inseparably and organically related in the one reality of love. So love and procreation. Now, following the tradition going back at least to Plato and found in Christian philosophy and theology, von Hildebrand holds that metaphysically speaking, all creation has its explanation, its necessary source in love. He writes, quote, "As God's love is the creative principle in the universe, so love is everywhere creation," end of quote. Now, in the case of angels, their being springs directly from the love of God, unmediated by any participation by other angels. But in the case of the human person, God chose to make their coming into existence to be mediated by the participation of other human persons. Human persons are truly co-creators with God of new human beings. But if love is the principle behind all creation, it will also be the case that love will be a central element in the equation of human participation in creation. And indeed, for von Hildebrand, love, and more particularly spousal love, is the interior animating principle of marriage. Again, philosophers would speak of the form or the essence of marriage. This means that if we were to ask where marriage gets its defining features, namely its permanence, its exclusivity, its obligation to faithfulness, the totality that it requires of the spouses, and as we will see, its fruitfulness in the laws governing it, the answer would be from the nature of love itself. Marriage raises these elements into the sphere of an objective and public bond, which both brings to completion the union for which the spousal love yearns but cannot itself establish. And it protects the reality of love from various factors, from human weakness, from the changeableness of the emotions, and so on. It's worth noting here that the permanence of marriage for Hildebrand is not rooted in the fact that the offspring are in need of two partners, as we just heard it is for Aquinas. The permanence of marriage is rooted in the nature of spousal love itself, which involves a depth and a totality of self-giving, which would actually be contradicted by the possibility of separation. For von Hildebrand, love is also defining of the marital act itself, as the act that is the highest realization and expression of spousal love. The act that, as we know, brings to completion the bond established in the vows. So the church speaks of love as being, of the marriage being consummated in the spousal act. That is, the marital act is for him not, in its definition, not straightforwardly a procreative act. It is rather, in its definition, an act of love, in virtue of which it is then procreative. It is especially here that the uniqueness of von Hildebrand's contribution becomes evident. To understand this, we have to take a look at Hildebrand's metaphysics of sexuality. Von Hildebrand maintains that the marital act is a unique kind of bodily psychic act, insofar as it is created to form one thing with a spiritual reality, and in particular, it's created to embody the spiritual reality of spousal love. This means, first, that sex isn't complete as a physical act. Rather, its very nature is such that it is ordained to be animated from within by spousal love. As such, secondly, and this is where Hildebrand finds evidence for the above claim, its structure as bodily psychic has qualities and characteristics that are an echo of the qualities and characteristics of spousal love, suiting the act precisely to be animated by that love. Hildebrand, in particular, draws attention to the inseparability of sex already in its bodily aspect from the depth of the person. In the sexual sphere, he says, body and soul meet in a unique fashion, such that, quote, nothing in the domain of sex is self-contained as in other bodily experiences, but rather that it tends to become incorporated with experiences of a higher order, purely psychological and spiritual, end of quote. While this depth is accessible, this depth of the bodily sexual reality is accessible to us only from within, and not by means of an external observation of the act. So, for example, somebody prior to puberty would not understand what we're speaking of. Hildebrand is also referring to an ontological depth, a metaphysical depth. Okay, so he's not just saying, oh, we experience sex as something deep. He's saying that experience signals that something very important is happening in the depth of the human person. And so these features of sex explain why it's suited to embodying a spiritual reality as deep and as central to the person as the reality of spousal love. Von Hildebrand writes, quote, we have here to do with an organic unity, deeply rooted in the attributes of wedded love on the one hand and of sex on the other. That's why, Hildebrand continues, sex can indeed keep silence, but when it speaks, it is no mere casual expression, but a voice from the depths, the utterance of something central and of the utmost significance. End of quote. So in short, the sexual act is quite unique as a physical act, insofar as it is made to form one thing with a spiritual reality, the spiritual reality of spousal love. So again, the analogy of a two-dimensional object is a good one. Here, spousal love takes on a second dimension in the sphere of the bodily psychic. So this, incidentally, is why, properly speaking, the term sex is not really fitting for the act. The term marital act is the term that properly captures its essence, because the term includes within its concept the fact that the act is constituted not of something purely physical, but of something physical containing an interior metaphysical space, fashioned for only one thing, a spousal love that has been fully realized in the marriage vows. Now, this embodiment gives spousal love something new. It gives it concrete outlines. So now the features of spousal love take on a kind of particularity and concretion. This is both in terms of the experience and the psyche of the spouses, and also in the physical features and in the physical gestures. Okay, and in and through this concretization, it actually brings about a new kind and a new degree of union, right? This making concrete then of the spiritual reality of spousal love is a very important point. On the basis of our analysis of love, we're now in a good position to see in what way this is the case. Due to its intimacy and depth, all right, which as a reminder is both experiential and ontological, sex becomes firstly the vehicle of a concrete act of self-donation of the spouses to one another. That's the first dimension of love, the unitive. The fact that it involves the depths of the person is why the marital act doesn't merely echo or symbolize what occurred in the vows during the marriage ceremony, but actually adds to it, completing the mutual self-donation. And so von Hildebrand writes of sexuality as being part of its very essence, quote, "In and with sex, man in a special sense gives himself," end of quote. Now, what are the concrete outlines that the second dimension, the dimension of fruitfulness, takes on in the marital act? As a concrete act of love, we must look for the concrete embodiment of fruitfulness that is most proper to it or most characteristic of it. Now, we know well that the coming into existence of the child is not the only fruit of the spousal act, but we have to say that it's a concretization of the highest fruit of the spousal act. So consequent upon this specific union of the spouses and flowing organically from it is the possible coming into existence of new human life. So the act that is so deeply meaningful to the spouses as spouses, even apart from its procreative potential, is, von Hildebrand writes, superabundantly fashioned by God to also be the act that brings the new human person into existence. But he emphasizes that we see not only that it is so, but that it makes all the sense in the world that it should be so. In his book on marriage, Hildebrand writes, quote, "The fact that the closest communion of love between two persons produces a new human being mysteriously reflects the fruitfulness of love as such." And in Purity, we read, in his book Purity, he says, "It is no accident that God has invested that act with creative significance. As God's love is the creative principle in the universe, so love is everywhere creation, and there is a profound significance in the nexus at once symbol and reality, whereby from the act in which two become one flesh, from love and in love, the new human being proceeds," end of quote. And so the act that is procreative is not simply also the act that binds the spouses together. It is precisely the fact that it is so binding that truly makes the child not merely a product of the cooperative activity of two human persons, but truly a fruit of love. The physical structures of the act reflect both the distinctness and the coming together of the two dimensions of union and fruitfulness, as well as the order between them, and, as it were, their mutual implication of one another. So the physical conditions of self-donation of the spouses provide the physical conditions of the coming to be of new human life. And this physical structure is a kind of reflection of what is the case on the spiritual level. So finally, contraception as an undoing of love. But now we have also here arrived at a defense of the Church's teaching that is powerful, both in the sense that it contains a deep but necessary logic, and also because it is so compelling experientially. Since the spousal act is internally structured as an act of love, it is subject to the necessary laws of love. To remind ourselves of the law of which we are speaking, love consists of the two dimensions of union and fruit, and the two are wholly intertwined with one another, wholly inseparable from one another. So the specific union of spouses in the marital act contains within itself the specific fruit, at least as its highest fruit and most proper one, the fruit of human procreativity. And so to directly remove from this act its procreative potential is to dismantle the act as an act of love. because of the close and organic union of this expression of union with this fruit. To reject this fruit is to witness to the fact that the act was not entered into as a means of union. By removing the fruitfulness proper to this concrete expression of love, the interior soul of the act is removed. In this case, the bodily act will be engaged in, but it will no longer be an expression of love. It won't be an expression of union. It will become an instrument used from some other end, perhaps for mere pleasure or for some other end. And so we've also here arrived at the formulation found in Humanae Vitae, which says, quote, "The Church teaches that each and every marriage act must remain open to the transmission of life. That teaching, often set forth by the magisterium, is founded upon the inseparable connection willed by God and unable to be broken by man on his own initiatives." So I want to pause over that for a second. Humanae Vitae doesn't tell us that we may not separate the two meanings. It tells us that we are not able to separate the two meanings. And now we understand why that is. Because to remove the procreative is actually to witness to the fact that the unitive could not have been there to begin with. It's to actually destroy the love itself. By safeguarding both these essential aspects, the unitive and the procreative, the conjugal act preserves in its fullness the sense of true mutual love. I just want to end by saying that I think von Hildebrand's position also really gives I would say, the metaphysical underpinnings that are present in the document Donum Vitae, which is on in vitro fertilization. It says in there that every child has the right to be conceived in a concrete act of love. And I think the fact that von Hildebrand sees that the child is truly a fruit of an act that is metaphysically structured as an act of love between the spouses, right? This is why the child must be conceived in this context, because to remove it from this context is actually to remove it from the context of love. Thank you very much.